For millions of Sunday evening viewers in Britain, Theo Burrell was the specialist who made porcelain and glassware feel like living history rather than dusty inventory. She had one of those rare on-screen qualities that can't really be taught, genuine curiosity, paired with a warmth that made every guest on Antiques Roadshow feel like their object mattered, whether it was worth £800 or $80,000. What most of those viewers didn't know for years was that behind the calm expertise and the easy warmth on camera, Burrell was fighting one of the cruelest diagnoses a person can receive, and doing it while raising a toddler, planning a wedding, and refusing to let the disease write the whole story of her life. She died on July 8, 2026, at the age of 39, 4 years after being told she likely had 12 to 18 months left. This is the story of how she spent those 4 years. Glioblastoma is, by almost any medical measure, one of the most difficult cancers a person can be diagnosed with. It grows quickly, resists most existing treatments, and rarely allows for the kind of full surgical removal that gives patients a genuine sense of closure. Median survival for adults diagnosed with the disease has improved only modestly over recent decades, and doctors are typically cautious about offering anything beyond broad ranges when patients ask how much time they have left. Burrell's own 12 to 18-month prognosis sat squarely within that range, and the fact that she lived 4 years beyond her diagnosis, long enough to marry her partner and watch her son start school, was itself a genuinely uncommon outcome that she never took for granted publicly. Theodora Helen Burrell was born in Edinburgh on September 1, 1986. Her interest in antiques started early and stayed remarkably specific. By her teenage years, she was already working as viewing staff at Lion & Turnbull, the Edinburgh auction house that would remain part of her professional life for the rest of her career. That early apprenticeship wasn't a summer job that happened to stick. It grew into a genuine academic path, an MA in history followed by an MLit in decorative arts, both completed at the University of Glasgow, while she kept returning to Lion & Turnbull as an intern and eventually a full specialist. Ceramics and glass became her particular expertise, the kind of knowledge that comes only from years of handling real objects rather than studying photographs of them. By the time she was in her early 30s, Burrell had built a genuinely respected reputation inside the auction world, the sort of behind-the-scenes credibility that television producers eventually go looking for when they want a new expert who can explain complicated history to an ordinary audience without talking down to them. In 2018, she joined the roster of specialists on the BBC's Antiques Roadshow, and within a relatively short time she became one of its more recognizable faces, not through showmanship, but through the same quality that had built her reputation in the auction house in the first place: real scholarship delivered with real enthusiasm. The show itself has always worked on a simple format. Members of the public bring in family heirlooms, car boot sale finds, and inherited curiosities, and a rotating team of specialists appraises them on camera at stately homes and public parks around the country. It is a format that lives or dies on the specialists themselves, since there's no script beyond the object in front of them. Burrell's particular gift was making a piece of 19th-century glassware feel like it had a story worth hearing regardless of what it might fetch at auction, and that quality made her a favorite among both regular viewers and the production team she worked alongside for 8 years. Her personal life was filling in alongside her professional one during those same years. She had been with her partner, Alex Lever, for well over a decade by the time their son Jonah was born in 2020. By any ordinary measure, this was a woman in the middle of building an enviable, full life, a fulfilling career, a young family, a home in East Lothian, Scotland. Nobody watching her appraise a Victorian tea set on a Sunday evening broadcast had any reason to suspect that within a couple of years, everything about that life would be tested in the most extreme way possible. The trouble started quietly, in the winter of 2021. What began as headaches gradually became something more alarming: vision problems, persistent sickness, and a pressure in her skull that never fully let up. Burrell later described the pattern as classic warning signs of a brain tumor, the kind that look obvious only in hindsight. At the time, she went back to her GP repeatedly, and each visit treated the symptoms individually rather than connecting them into a single, more frightening picture. That is, unfortunately, a common story among people eventually diagnosed with rare brain cancers. The early symptoms mimic far more ordinary conditions, and the delay between first symptom and accurate diagnosis can stretch on for months. The answer finally came not through a scheduled appointment, but through an emergency room visit. At Edinburgh's Royal Infirmary, a scan revealed a 5-centimeter tumor deep in her brain. Burrell described the shock of that moment as almost impossible to absorb in real time. The words from the medical team didn't fully register until the following day, in a more detailed conversation with a neurosurgeon, when the actual scope of what she was facing became clear. She was 35 years old. At home was a 1-year-old son who had no idea that his mother's entire world had just been upended in a matter of minutes. Speaking later on BBC Radio Scotland's Good Morning Scotland, Burrell walked listeners through those 6 months in plain, unflinching terms, the winter of 2021 bringing on worsening headaches, sickness, and vision problems that built for months before anyone connected them to something this serious. She was candid that she'd had no warning it was coming, describing the diagnosis itself as a genuine shock rather than the confirmation of something she'd feared. That kind of directness, describing a life-altering event without softening it for an audience, became something of a hallmark of how she spoke publicly about her illness in the years that followed. In June 2022, doctors confirmed what the scan had suggested: glioblastoma, a grade 4 brain tumor and the most aggressive form of brain cancer that exists. The prognosis that came with it was brutal in its specificity: 12 to 18 months. For a 35-year-old mother of a 1-year-old, that timeline meant confronting the real possibility of missing nearly every milestone that parents take for granted. Second birthdays, first days of school, all of it. Surgery followed almost immediately, removing as much of the tumor as could be safely reached, though glioblastoma is notorious for making complete removal impossible. What came after was a grueling course of treatment. 17 rounds of chemotherapy in total, spread out over months that combined exhaustion and uncertainty with the entirely ordinary demands of raising a toddler. Burrell was, in effect, doing 2 of the hardest jobs a person can do at the same time: fighting for her life and trying to keep her son's life as normal as possible. The statistics she learned along the way became, in her own words, more than numbers on a page. Brain tumors kill more people under 40 than any other form of cancer, and yet historically they have received only around 1% of national cancer research funding in the UK. That imbalance would go on to become one of the defining causes of the years she had left. Not an abstract talking point, but something she had a very personal stake in changing for the people who would be diagnosed after her. Treatment itself came with side effects that were easy to overlook from the outside, but very real to live with day to day. Steroids prescribed as part of her ongoing care led to noticeable weight gain, something she mentioned openly on social media rather than hiding, alongside the persistent tiredness that came with an aggressive treatment schedule. Even so, she talked about getting outside on good days with a fitness tracker, trying to hold on to some version of an active, ordinary routine in between hospital visits, another small example of the way she refused to let the illness become the only thing happening in her life. Many people facing a terminal diagnosis understandably choose privacy. Burrell chose the opposite path almost immediately, giving interviews, appearing on BBC Radio Scotland, and posting regular, unvarnished updates on social media. She was careful never to romanticize what she was going through. In one widely shared reflection, she made a distinction that came to define how people understood her journey. The cancer itself was never something to celebrate, but being alive certainly was. That distinction shaped how she talked about her own life. Ordinary milestones, Jonah's second birthday, his first day of school, family celebrations that most people barely register as significant, became things she spoke about with visible gratitude, because doctors had never promised her she would see them. She was equally honest about the fear that came with all of it, including the very specific dread of not living long enough to watch her son grow up. Being able to say, later, that those early fears hadn't come true became one of the things she said she was proudest of. Standing beside her through all of it was Alex, her partner of 13 years by the time they finally married. The couple had been together long enough to share a home, a dog, and a young son before deciding to formalize things, a detail Burrell mentioned with some wry affection when she first announced the engagement online, joking that after 13 years, a dog, 2 houses, and a child, the wedding itself was almost an afterthought. On March 28, 2026, the two were married in an intimate ceremony in Edinburgh, surrounded by close family and friends, with Burrell in a sequin-embellished white gown and Alex in a dark gray suit. Burrell shared the news on Instagram with visible joy, writing that after so many years together, it felt wonderful to finally be able to call him her husband, and that the day had been filled with sunshine, good food, and champagne. It was a wedding that, by her own account, had once felt like it might never happen, and reaching it became one of the milestones she valued most in an illness defined by uncertainty. Only a week after the ceremony, she was due to learn the results of a fresh scan, a reminder of how closely joy and fear were living side by side in that period of her life. By October 2025, the disease reasserted itself. A scan revealed the tumor was regrowing, and Burrell made the difficult decision to share that news publicly as well, telling the Sunday Times that the coming Christmas could realistically be one of her last with her young son and her partner. On social media, she was equally candid about the psychological toll of living with a disease like this, describing the exhausting, near-constant worry that comes with wondering whether every small ache is a sign of progression. Even in that stretch, she kept finding things to be grateful for and said so publicly: a fundraiser, a friend's wedding, birthday parties, and the small, unremarkable rhythms of daily life, laundry, dishes, dinner, that she said had taken on new meaning simply because she was still able to do them. That Christmas came and went, followed by several more months that nobody, including her own medical team, had been able to guarantee her. Her advocacy work grew louder rather than quieter as her own prognosis worsened. She became an official patron of the charity Brain Tumor Research, using that platform to push publicly for greater government investment in a historically underfunded area of cancer research. In March 2026, she recorded a video for the UK's Department of Health and Social Care in which she spoke about the limits of her own remaining treatment options, and made clear that even if new research came too late to help her personally, she would find real peace in knowing it might help the next patient who received the same diagnosis she once had. Just days before her death, Burrell posted a quiet, reflective photo on social media marking 4 years since her original diagnosis, a final public note that carried the same gratitude that had defined her entire public journey. She died peacefully on Wednesday, July 8, 2026, surrounded by her family. In the statement her family shared publicly a few days later, they said plainly that neither Burrell nor her medical team had expected her decline to happen quite so quickly. Her family described her as someone who fought hard, for her own life, for the people she loved, and for raising awareness of a disease that remains cruelly underfunded relative to how many lives it takes. They said she was able to see life events, like her son's first day of school and her own wedding, that 4 years earlier they never thought she would live to see. They also spoke about the community she found among other brain cancer patients and families, describing it as a source of real comfort during her darkest stretches, and said what she would likely want most now is for other people facing similar diagnoses to find some measure of hope in how she lived through hers. She is survived by her husband Alex, their son Jonah, her parents Ian and Marion, and her brother Tom, along with colleagues at Lion and Turnbull and the wider Antiques Roadshow production team who had come to know her over 8 years on the show. Tributes followed quickly from within the antiques world and beyond it, from colleagues who had worked alongside her at filming locations across the country to viewers who had never met her but had followed her story for years through her own updates. What came through in nearly all of them was the same observation, that Burrell had managed something genuinely rare, staying completely herself, curious, warm, occasionally self-deprecating, through a 4-year ordeal that would have understandably hardened or silenced many other people. Part of what made Burrell's advocacy so effective was her refusal to let her own experience stay abstract. She repeated, in nearly every interview and public appearance, the same uncomfortable statistic. Brain tumors kill more people under the age of 40 in the UK than any other cancer, and yet the disease has historically received only around 1% of national cancer research funding. For a woman who had spent 5 or 6 months bouncing between GP appointments before her own tumor was finally caught in an emergency room, that funding gap wasn't a policy footnote. It was the difference between an earlier diagnosis and the one she actually received. That is part of why her final public message, recorded for the UK's Department of Health and Social Care in March 2026, resonated as widely as it did. She wasn't asking for sympathy on behalf of herself. She was asking a government body to direct more resources toward research that might arrive too late to help her, but in time to help someone else's family avoid the same 6 months of uncertainty she had lived through. Health officials and fellow patients alike have pointed to that message as one of the more genuinely selfless public statements to come out of a terminal cancer diagnosis in recent memory, not because it was dramatic, but because it was calm, specific, and entirely focused on outcomes for people she would never meet. Brain Tumor Research, the charity whose patron Burrell became in 2023, has spent years pressing successive UK governments on exactly the funding gap she spoke about, the fact that brain tumors take more years of life from patients under 40 than any other cancer, while receiving a fraction of the research investment that better-funded cancers attract. Having a public figure willing to attach her own name, face, and lived experience to that campaign gave the charity's message a reach it couldn't have achieved through statistics alone. It is one thing to read that a disease is underfunded. It is another to watch someone you recognize from Sunday evening television describe, in plain terms, what living with that underfunded disease actually costs her family. What rarely came through in a 5-minute segment on Antiques Roadshow was how much energy an ordinary day now cost her. In an interview with BBC Radio Scotland, Burrell described how something as simple as a full day off, coffee with friends, a bit of shopping, could leave her needing to spend the entire next day in bed recovering. She had lost her driving license as a consequence of the diagnosis, and with it a piece of the independence most people never think to be grateful for. She spoke, too, about a new kind of fear that had settled into her life permanently, not knowing what was coming next, and living on a 3-month cycle of scans that brought a fresh wave of headaches, nausea, and worry every time the next appointment came into view. And yet, in that same interview, she was careful to note what the diagnosis had also given her, in its own strange way. She described learning to live day to day rather than constantly projecting forward, and said she had largely stopped losing sleep over the smaller worries that used to keep her up at night. It's a perspective she returned to again in 2023, telling Brain Tumor Research that she had found herself able to enjoy the present in a way she never had before her diagnosis, having spent most of her adult life, by her own admission, living mentally in the future instead. That shift, from anticipating what was coming to appreciating what was actually happening, became one of the most consistent threads running through everything she said publicly over 4 years. It's worth remembering what kind of show Burrell was part of, because it shapes why her story resonated the way it did. Antiques Roadshow has been a fixture of British television since 1979, built entirely around ordinary members of the public bringing in family heirlooms and car boot sale finds for a panel of specialists to examine on camera, with no script beyond whatever object happens to be sitting on the table. It is, by design, a show about the small, tangible things people hold onto across generations. A grandmother's brooch, a grandfather's medal, a piece of furniture nobody quite remembers the origin of. Burrell's specialty within that world was European ceramics, fine furniture, and decorative art dating back to around 1860, and she brought to each appraisal the same quality that had made her stand out at Lyon and Turnbull years earlier, a willingness to treat every object, and every guest, as genuinely worth her full attention. There is something quietly fitting about a woman who spent her career explaining why ordinary objects carry outsized meaning: a chipped teacup that survived a war, a ring passed down through 4 generations, coming to describe her own remaining time in almost identical terms. The washing on the line, the school run, an ordinary Tuesday dinner, these became, in her own words, the things worth treasuring precisely because they were common and easily overlooked. It is not a coincidence that a specialist trained to see value in the overlooked would eventually apply that same instinct to her own life. Burrell's death on July 8, 2026, brought a wave of tributes that went well beyond the usual professional condolences. Brain Tumor Research, the charity she had served as patron since 2023, described her as phenomenal, determined, and truly inspiring, and said the organization would continue pursuing the mission she had championed. The Brain Tumor Charity issued its own statement expressing similar shock and sorrow. Within the BBC, Antiques Roadshow host Fiona Bruce spoke of Burrell as a vibrant, talented colleague who had faced her illness with real dignity and strength, a sentiment echoed in a joint statement from the show's production team, which highlighted both her expertise and her warmth toward the guests she worked with. On July 19, 11 days after her death, a repeat broadcast of Antiques Roadshow closed with a dedicated tribute segment, Remembering Theo Burrell, featuring a montage of her appraising items across her 8 years on the show, including a moment where Fiona Bruce can be heard thanking her directly on camera. For a program built around objects that outlive the people who once owned them, it was a fitting way to mark the loss of one of the specialists who had spent years explaining exactly why that kind of permanence matters. It is a strange kind of symmetry that a woman who spent her career studying objects built to outlast their original owners ends up being remembered, above all, for something far less tangible: the record of how she chose to face an impossible situation. She never pretended the diagnosis was anything other than what it was. She also never let it be the only thing that defined her 4 years. A wedding that once seemed unlikely. A son's early milestones that she wasn't sure she'd live to see. A public platform used, again and again, not for sympathy but to push for research funding that might someday change the odds for someone else's family. From a teenage apprenticeship in an Edinburgh auction house to a nationally recognized voice for brain tumor research, Theo Burrell's life touched more people than any single television appearance could account for. The honesty she brought to an unimaginably difficult 4 years, refusing false optimism, but also refusing despair, is the part of her story that seems likely to outlast even the porcelain and glass she spent her career studying.